Good afternoon. My name is Greg Meyer. I'm a distinguished engineer with a company called Cerner Corporation, and with me is Bryan Kelly. He is a senior architect. And I apologize. I've been fighting a pretty bad cold for about the last 10 days, so I was pretty much immune to anything they'll let me bring on the plane. So we'll try to push through this, but I apologize if I start hacking up along here. So we're going to spend here about the next 30 minutes talking about some real cases that we've run into through our journey with Concourse, doing software developments, continuous integration, continuous delivery, as well as how we've been able to apply some of those same concepts over into the DevOps world, specifically as we start talking about infrastructure, which I think that's actually really, really cool. So as we jump into this, let's set a little context here for about 5 minutes. When we jumped in, we started out first with a problem statement. So this is a totally unique problem statement. You never ever heard this before. Create and deploy quality code efficiently and as often as needed. Nobody's ever heard that before. So as we started doing some analysis on this, we kind of look at it from two different perspectives, one being the technical side and then the other one being more of the policy and process and regulation side. So me being an engineer, I like starting over on the technical side of that. So as we start thinking about CI/CD, the first piece that we start thinking of is where does our code operate? Where are we going deploying this thing to? Where's it all going to go run? So there's kind of two different thoughts out there. A lot of us are very familiar with this. We've got the pets and we have versus cattle. So in pets versus cattle, in the pets, we've got these very well maintained, or actually more manually maintained virtual machines, God help us, bare metal, in these old dilapidated data centers that don't get really a lot of love inside of them. Now that can create some problems when it comes to continuous deployment. We get a lot of things from our operations side, like you can't deploy anything because we've got to go do a OS upgrade, or we have to go do a CVE patch, or it's Christmas. Everybody's taking off, so we can't do any deployments for the next 4 weeks. A lot of you probably heard these over the years. And we move over into the cattle space, everything becomes a lot more commoditized. These things are now ephemeral. If we need to do an upgrade, we just kind of toss one of these to the side, we throw in a brand new VM, and away we go. And in terms of hardware, especially when you start getting into public clouds, it's a lot easier to get newer and updated hardware. Folks like Azure, AWS, they're always going out and deploying brand new hardware. So as we're going to see, there's actually some advantages that we're going to get in the cattle world when it comes to DevOps. So switching gears over to the regulatory side, Cerner Corporation, we write medical software, and a lot of that is classified as a medical device, which puts us in direct scrutiny of the FDA. We're also an ISO 9000 certified company, which basically means everything we do has a very well-defined process attributed to it. So you can imagine there's a lot of artifacts, a lot of paperwork, a lot of stopping points inside of our software development processes, and we start feeling a lot like this. Developers are always feeling like we're running into somebody telling, stop, you can't move. So what do we go do about that? Well, there's one option. I don't recommend this, especially if you're dealing with the FDA, unless you have a fine affinity to the color orange. Another way that we look at it is we completely change our perspective of how we look at our development processes and how those relate to our ISO processes. And we actually heard a little bit about this in the keynote this morning. Things start becoming and working more hand in hand. So to give you an example here is I go do a black box test. As soon as that gets done, maybe that goes and kicks off automatically something to an artifact that somebody needs to go sign off on. Once that gets signed off on, it automatically kicks back into the software development process, and then we just move on and on and on and so forth. So it becomes more of a hand-in-hand shepherd approach to that. So quickly, CI/CD, and I love the term CI/CD. It's always got that slash through it because a lot of companies see these as two completely different things. You have your continuous integration done by your development team and continuous development, which a lot of times is done by your DevOps team, and these guys don't ever really communicate well together. So if we quickly look at this, we've got the continuous integration, and basically a few steps here. You build, you test, you package. And then you do this over and over and over again, and we have our favorite tools like something like Jenkins. So where do the developers go with that after that? Well, a lot of times they just see a big fence or a big wall, and they Doesn't really go anywhere other than what's on the other side of that wall is where we have our continuous delivery, our data centers. And that's where our DevOps teams live. Now, a lot of times, and it's probably in a lot of your cases, the only communication that happens between our development teams and our DevOps team is probably tickets or JIRAs or service requests. They don't ever talk to each other, and then they literally just punt their end states over the wall, and now into continuous delivery. And then the continuous delivery folks, they have their own separate tools. They may have automation tools such as Spinnaker or Chef, Ansible, or Puppet. And then that's their process. So we don't really get this nice fluid thought going from continuous integration to continuous deployment. We don't have a cross-functional team. So introducing in is concourse. I didn't intend this to be kind of a concourse 101, but I'll kind of give you the lowdown very quickly. Concourse is a tool that pipelines the software development or the CI and CD processes all the way from coding all the way taking it out to getting into production. So you can say, well, there's other tools that do like that, like Jenkins now has Jenkins pipeline. So what's kind of the things that pull me towards concourse? Well, number one, the concourse is very, very ephemeral in how it does everything. When you do a build job, it basically spins up a VM, it's a Docker container, does its thing, and then it just tosses it. And if you've ever had to manage, Jenkins boxes, what did Bryan tell me? You've spent like 20 to 30% of your time just tending to these pets of Jenkins boxes. That all goes away with concourse. The other side of it as well is that these pipelines are very, very declarative in nature. You actually use YAML to define what your pipeline looks like, so it's all written in code. And there's three very simple concepts in there. There's resources, jobs, and tasks. And the resources are those things like your source code repository or where your end states goes, Artifactory, or even something like Cloud Foundry itself, an instance could be a resource. And then we have the jobs which act on those resources, and the tasks are really just those implementation details inside of a job. If you've ever done or looked at some of the documentation for concourse, you can find a ton of examples out there that will show something very similar to this, that shows taking something directly from code right into production. So they got like my product, which could be a source code repository, doing a unit test, build a release candidate, do some smoke testing, integration tests, and then they'll go ship it and move it on, put it into production, and bump up the versioning. And oh my God, wouldn't that be so cool if all of us could take a pipeline, click a button, automatically go from source code to production in literally seconds or minutes. And in fact, there's a lot of startup companies out there that can do this, or those that don't have a big regulatory process. They can sit there and just click the button over and over and over again. And Concourse is extremely, extremely efficient and automated of moving code through a complete system like that. You can do tens to even hundreds of deployments every single day going through this. Unfortunately, I live in the real world, and so to a lot of us, that doesn't actually work for us. So where do we go from here? Well, at Cerner, we looked at a pipeline, and we looked at our current processes, and then we broke that out and modeled it into a pipeline. And this was our case study alpha, and it ended up looking something like this. You can say, Greg, that looks really convoluted and really complicated, and it kind of is. There's a lot of things that we do going through our processes. We actually have 5 environments that we move things through. And one of the cool things Concourse has is this grouping mechanism. It's actually a directive inside of the YAML called a group. And using groups, we can now logically split out the different pieces of the pipeline, and they have this nice little metaphor that looks like this. So now you can identify where all your different pieces of the pipeline are. So quickly going through this, we started in dev. Like I said, we have 5. We have a dev, which is development, dev test, which is where we do our black box testing for developers, QAs inside of dev cert, and then prod and staging. Staging and prod. So if we look at our resources, we have our source code in there. We happen to have a Chef repo in here. I'll get into that in a second. And then we have some scripts out there that help along with the tasks. One thing worth mentioning in the tasks is there are some really, really great open source tasks out there. One of my favorites out there was by Patrick, is it Crocker? He's got some really good ones out there in open source. I highly suggest you look at them, and actually we're going to see that in our case study beta. So we check our code in. These things automatically trigger off of a code check-in. We develop it, builds an end state, deploys it out to our back-end systems, and then we do integration tests. And one thing you'll notice is that we actually have 2 integration tests in here. My current product that I own, we're currently on those pets and legacy systems, but we're moving everything right now over to Pivotal Cloud Foundry, which is awesome, and just in and amongst itself, that's a whole nother talk. But from the developer's perspective, they don't really know. It's just a pipeline that takes my code in, deploys it, tests it. They just don't really care where it goes. So once we move from there, we can go into our black box testing. It goes into this what we call dev tests. We start applying versioning to them. So you'll see all the way on the left, you probably can't read it. It's a semver file, semantic versioning. We'll do a build again. We'll deploy it to the backend's integration test, publish a Maven site. We'll create a tag of the source code, and then it stops. So why does it stop? Why can't we move it through? This really is kind of a function of 2 things. Number 1, it's the culture. It's that non-cross-functional culture. And number 2 is a function of these legacy systems. We are kind of forced into doing a cumulative cadenced approach. And what that means is that we can only release code into production at some interval. A lot of companies run into this where they may only be able to do a release once a month or maybe every 2 months. We have to give notification in our process of at least 2 weeks before we can move anything in there. So as you can see, cadences to me are actually the antithesis of trying to do any type of efficient continuous delivery. But for now, it is what it is. So we go into our QA process, and all these cumulative things that have stacked up, we all move them over at once. There's actually a promotion process that we have to go through here. You can't see that very well. But what that is that takes a state of what was currently done in a semver file and moves it into a new semver file, which is our certification version. And the reason why we do that is because since it's cumulative, this QA part can actually take days, sometimes even up to a week. But we don't want to stop our developers from doing all the work that they're doing. So they're working on their test versions, and they can continue to do theirs without creating any interference with what's going on over in certification. So again, we deploy, we integration test, QA signs off on it. We move into staging and then on into production, and life looks good. One thing to notice is at the very end of this, we're creating a rollback version. Our ISO processes state that if anything goes wrong, we have to have the ability to roll back to our previous version. There are a few philosophies on that, the fail forward and fail back. Because we're in a cadenced process, it's really hard to fail forward. Even if we have an emergency release, those still sometimes could take 2 or 3 days, and we don't want to be stuck in a bad state for that long. So we have to fail back, whereas if you get into a good streamlined approach where you can turn these things in minutes or hours, you can really start doing a fail forward. So that's case study alpha. Case study beta, we are doing a new solution that's all running on AWS and Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and actually case study alpha is going to be there and hopefully in about 6 months. And because now we don't have to worry about these cadenced approaches, we can actually start getting a lot more liquidity to our software and our microservices. We can start pushing these things through as needed instead of cadencing them all through. So our process gets a lot more streamlined. This actually looks a lot more like that example that we saw earlier, where we start with a version, we build it, we test it after it's been deployed to the back end. And then if we're good with that, we'll move into QA. If that goes good, then we'll ship it, staging, and production. So the big piece that I haven't added in here is where does the ISO process fall into that? And as I mentioned earlier on, you really want these things to become byproducts of each other, where once I complete one part of the process, it does the ISO, and then when the ISO piece gets done, it moves on through here. The cool thing you can do inside of Concourse is that all these ISO process pieces and artifacts can just become another resource. It doesn't actually change the pipeline at all. So give you an example, when we move through and you can't see this very well, so I apologize. When we move through our integration tests, black box testing, we could automatically just fire off or create something in Jira or Confluence or whatever the appropriate tool is. I can go send an email off to who the appropriate person is or persons. And then when they go sign off that, we may have a webhook inside that gets picked up back in through the pipeline and then automatically moves it into QA. And then as it goes through QA, gets integration tests, we go fire off another artifact that somebody has to go sign off on, gets picked up again when it's done, and then we can go to ship it, then go to staging, which might create a transfer to production form. Everybody signs off on that, and then we move into staging. So we've now been able to take the pipeline piece of it and really make the ISO process just another first-class citizen inside of our pipeline without really having to change what we're doing inside of the pipeline. So I know I went really fast. That's a big mouthful here. That's what we're doing with software development. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of things that can also be done on the DevOps side using these exact same pipeline approach, and I don't want to take any of his thunder. And with that, I'm going to move over to Bryan.
Thank you, Greg. So it's a cool picture, right? So we in our PCF project, we were hoping to create a lot of consistency. And that consistency came from being able to create pipelines of pipelines where a project such as this may be made up of 10 or 15 microservices, all of their pipelines would look the same. And the promotion process would be the same, and the traceability and all the ISO artifacts that we acquire would be the same. And it ends up just being a bunch of different params that are fed into the pipeline template, basically. And we thought that was a really cool concept. We've been working on this for a couple months now, and we hooked up like Slack notifications and all that kind of stuff. And we were approached by Paul Hopper, our platform architect with Pivotal, and said, you know, how do you like updating all of these tiles in Ops Manager? So today, they're not even all up there. I couldn't fit them on the slide. Right? There's so much capability, there's so much functionality, it's so exciting, there's new features coming out every day, and we haven't even worked with other vendors yet. This is just what Pivotal's providing us. And we have to take these updates. It's important. They have CVEs in them, so the runtime, we have to take updates to it, we have to take updates to the data services, and up until probably July, we would download it from Pivotal Network. I had to put it on an external hard drive because sometimes I didn't even have enough disk space on my laptop because some of these are 6 gigs or more. So I'd download it, I'd import the product into the Ops Manager. I'd hope that I would normally go try to find a LAN cable somewhere because otherwise it'd take forever because I was on a Wi-Fi connection. And, you know, maybe an hour or two later, I would, hit apply changes and the changes would flow through my environment. And then, if there was a stem cell, I'd have to do the same thing. And then I was doing this for all the different tiles. And to kind of outline all the steps that were being passed through, these are all the steps that I was doing before. So I would, for on the left side is an Ops Manager upgrade. I would go and download the Ops Manager OVA if I was on vSphere, or the OpenStack image, or the lights. I would find the AMI ID on the YAML document and PivNet. I would then try to go find it in the marketplace and make sure that I was in the right region when I was in AWS, because normally I would forget. And so there was a lot of errors that would happen. I'd also have to make sure I exported my installation.zip file from my Ops Manager, and then I'd have to import it back in. And I would normally find a LAN cable for that too, because up until recently that thing was massive. It was like 11 or 16 gigs. And there was just a lot of latency and a lot of error that could happen in the system. And there was even more things I had to do when there was a Elastic runtime upgrade, because I'd have to also make sure that I grabbed all the stem cells. Oh, and also when the Ops Manager would upgrade, you'd have to go re-import all the stem cells that were associated to all the different tiles if they were on different versions. So there was just a lot of work. A lot of work to get the automation going. It's kind of funny because it's like it's going and touching 200 VMs. It's doing a lot of work, but I wasn't happy. There was still a lot of work. So Paul got us in connection with Ryan Pei, and he has a talk later today or tomorrow on PCF pipelines. It's a real thing. It does work. It is not smoke and mirrors. It's a GitHub project today. You can go look at it today. It's also on PivNet now under beta. It's a really cool feature. And what you end up having is this view in concourse of the job's tasks. And a job has a bunch of tasks associated to it. And the machine now is downloading the image, and it's uploading the ERT tile upgrade into Ops Manager and hitting apply changes for you. And then I have it to where it sends me a Slack notification. That's the little guy at the bottom when it's all done. So I get a notification too. And so it's a lot of work that's been saved and a lot of time that's been taken off my plate. I've also been able to, through a regulator, which is part of PCF pipelines, I've been able to get continuous updates from PivNet. So in fact, I don't know what's up with this, but if you start using this project, you'll get the updates before they send you an email to say there's a release. It'll be in your environment already. You're like, wait a minute, I thought only my web browser could do this, but now I can do over-the-air updates of my platform.
And your developers don't know.
And your developers don't know because it's doing it in uptime, right? So what we put together was a demonstration for our compliance people, actually. We still haven't completely got through all the hoops with this, but the concept is we have a regulator that's doing the CI portion with PivNet that's continuously integrating with Pivotal Network and seeing if there's an ops manager upgrade or, for instance, a service, MySQL was the example here, a tile upgrade, or the ERT. Any tile is applicable, even tiles produced by vendors. So like we've used the New Relic tile, and it's worked with the New Relic tile. It's worked with some other tiles that we've beta tested. And so what will happen is in our example, it will automatically download and install into a sandbox environment where it's in isolation. It's a white room. It's isolated from the rest of the developer workloads because we treat dev like prod. We feel our developers deserve to have a production-like system for their development now. I lived 10 years of having my dev people complain to me about having, hardware that's 6 years older than what's in prod or inconsistencies in images. I said, we're done with that. With our move to AWS and our move to Cloud Foundry, we will treat dev like prod. I'm giving it back to the developers. And so we broke out the CI process into a sandbox. If sandbox passes, it does three things. It triggers off the regulator, so the regulator runs every 30 minutes, sees if there's an update on PivNet that matches a regex, so we can control the version, downloads the new version of Sala Ops Manager, applies it in Sandbox, and that may take, if there's a SIM cell associated to it, it could take, 6 hours. It may take a while. I get a Slack notification that it started. I'll get a Slack notification if it failed, God help me, and I'll get a Slack notification when it's done. And when that completes, right now what we're showing is since there's smoke tests associated to the runs of all the errands in PCF, we auto-promote to the development domain. And we have done a process, a feature in Concourse where you say, hey, I need to pass Sandbox, and I also want to get the version of the resource that you applied to Sandbox applied to non-prod, or the dev environment. So the version that you then deploy in non-prod will never be something that you've tested in isolation in Sandbox first. And the purpose of that is traceability. ISO requires that we show through some compliance that we've taken an update in one environment, applied it in another environment prior to going to production. It's just the way that it is. So if that's the requirement, we'll make the machines do all the requirement work and checking the boxes. I'm not going to do that work anymore. So the version gets passed to non-prod. If it passes to non-prod, then it gets passed on to prod, and we trigger a prod deployment. So we ran through a couple initial runs. This weekend, I was so tickled because it finally happened that the Elastic Runtime released, and it also had a massive stem cell upgrade. And it took about 12 hours to take 220 VMs across Sandbox, non-prod, and prod to be patched to that ERT version and the stem cells upgraded, and 0 people were involved in the process. 0. And I was so happy.
Yeah, no, like 0 of our developers have even known that this is going on.
And nobody got impacted, and there was no downtime.
impact.
So we were super stoked. And so what we would like to do is, there's just a lot of people we'd like to thank. One, go look at concourse.ci. It's changing all the time. They've simplified their BOSH release, and it's getting even easier with time. They've got support now for CredHub. There's a lot of really cool things. We're able to move all of our credential management. So you need to have credentials to log into the Ops Manager and all that. We put that in CredHub. And so it's in a secure encrypted store. It's not on my laptop anymore. And I really appreciate that. And then there's documentation for Concourse. There's tutorials. Starks and Wayne has a ton of great tutorials for app developers. And there we go. Thank you. And we'd also like to thank Patrick. He provided us a great kickstart to our app development process. He provided a Maven CLI or a Maven resource in Concourse. He provided a really, really cool CF CLI resource in Concourse that I had not been able to find. There was an old one that was out there, and no offense if the person is in the room right now, but the one that Patrick's got can do a lot of other really cool things than just do CF push. It can create services, delete services, create user-provided services as part of a pipeline. So then those credentials can get put in CredHub and then rolled out to the platform or rotated. There's a lot of really cool stuff, and then there's some really great talks that we strongly encourage everybody to go take a look at while they're out here, and we appreciate you coming out and seeing our talk.
And don't miss Ryan's. I believe he wrote a lot of this stuff, so he's going to be talking in this room, I believe, at 3:40 or sometime this afternoon, so go see it. He'll be talking about a lot of these updates, and then there'll be another one that Rich is going to do on Thursday, so some great talks coming up.
Yep.
So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
So we've actually got 4 minutes. If anybody's got any questions, we can field anything here for a few minutes. Yes, sir.
Yeah, there's a
Repeat the
project.
question.
There's a great project. So the question was, how do you generate the pipeline? Because the ones that are out on GitHub, you can't fix the version. So two things. If you work with your platform architect, there is a PivNet release of PCF pipelines now that have the versions fixed. So you can get part of the beta program. I think that's what we did, right, Paul? Yeah, so there's a beta program for it that has it as a PivNet resource. So one of the pipelines I didn't show was a pipeline of pipelines that actually downloads the PCF pipelines as a tarball from PivNet and then rolls out the pipeline for us. One modification we did make, and I have not gotten Ryan's approval to do this yet, was we took all the jobs and we actually concatenated them together. Instead of being 3 individual pipelines, we made it 1. But there is PCF Maestro, that's a GitHub project that we used for inspiration, that actually does the work that you're talking about. And it can download from PivNet, or it can download a tag from Git. And it will roll the pipelines out based upon the tag. It works okay, but it's not getting maintained as much right now. And you can definitely talk to Ryan at 310 if you want more information.
I get one more question. Yes, sir.
Great question. So the question was, what do we do if there's new prompts? So we've given that feedback back to the tile developers. This process is highly tailored to patch releases, so getting the CVEs out fast and stem cell upgrades out fast. And we've been giving them feedback that we really shouldn't change the form inputs in patch releases. It should only be in feature releases. I don't know if that feedback has been, we've had a lot of success for the past 6 months, so maybe they did take that feedback to heart. But right now, today, answering new questions is problematic, but we don't have the regex set up to take like a 2.2 version of MySQL. We don't take the 2.2 version autonomously yet. However, there is an Ops Manager API to fill out those questions, and if you look at PCF Pipelines install PCF on a given IaaS, there's a demonstration in PCF Pipelines of a pipeline that will seed the Elastic runtime with all of the answers that you would want after the environment's been terraformed. And it's called, I think, product properties. You can actually call that Ops Manager API, and you can set all the properties based upon configuring a YAML document. So there is, and if you go /docs on your Ops Manager, all the documentation for the REST API is right there. And all you need is an OAuth token, and you can go to town on it. It's really, really cool.
We do have 2 more minutes if anybody else has got a quick question.
No? Awesome.
All right,
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. We appreciate it.